Christopher wanted one thing in the world, his mother. He felt that no one his age had lost their mother, and to some degree, he was right. The world felt colder now that she was gone. Sonic the Hedgehog, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Tournament Fighters. 2 of his cherished games had collected dust in the corner of his room. His desire to play his favorite of them all, Jurassic Park, had waned. The Sega Genesis remained packed in its box. Christopher did not touch any of those games, or the other memories in there either. He was new to Chinook, Washington, but not by much. His father's name was John, and they moved from North Carolina to Washington once the school year ended. Saying goodbye to his friends was hard. Leaving behind his childhood home and abandoning his mother was harder. 3rd grade was a year he wished to scrub from his mind, and here he sat now, staring out into the world from his bedroom window. New school and legends, new home and neighbors, new stepmom, and his first Washington autumn. Christopher stared into the twilight of October autumn. He thought of a few things he heard on the first day of school back in August. Since he was the new kid, his fellow 4th graders were eager to warn him of the abandoned house he lived next to. Many people had tried to live there, but no one stayed. The house had become unsellable. Stories of ghosts and hauntings drove people away. As the house aged, its paint began to peel and its windows began to split and crack. Vines and moss inched up from the ground and wrapped the house in its earthy clutches. Once the siding had faded to brown and the roof slumped in and rodents forsook it, the house had cemented itself as a local secret whispered only by children. There were only 2 things entering that house: realtors and insects. John and his wife, Nancy, had tried to establish that the house wasn't anything to be afraid of. Nancy reassured Christopher that he would be safe playing outside. She had lived in Chinook for 12 years, and that the house next door was only a story. Christopher did not care much for Nancy. He felt that she was trying to replace his mother when she comforted him. But her love was sincere. Once they moved from North Carolina when the July summer was hottest, John met Nancy. They began dating after a few weeks of talking and texting. Christopher felt like the world was moving on without him, and he didn't mind. Christopher did not want a new mother. He wanted his mom, and no one else. Nancy tried to read him bedtime stories, dig out the video games and play, go for bike rides and picnics, go for ice cream and to the movies, and to share the love that poured from her heart. Christopher could never allow himself to betray his mother by loving Nancy. Christopher pulled himself from the windowsill and climbed into bed. His bedroom was plain and boxes were still stacked. It had been months, and he kept most of his things packed away. Deep within him, he refused to unpack, because he hoped that one day they would return home. He pulled his blanket to his chin and rolled over in bed. At some unknown hour of the night, Chris turned in his bed, awoken by a soft scratch against his windowsill. He lay with his eyes open in the dark. He fidgeted beneath his blanket as the world became cold. As he watched, another scratch surfaced from the thick silence. He reminded himself that his bedroom was on the 2nd floor and that no one could climb up. The silence returned, and the moon sailed across the sky. Christopher couldn't tell when he fell asleep, only that he did once he woke up in the morning. Christopher rubbed his eyes. He muttered to himself that the scratching from last night was part of his dreams. As he looked out the window, he saw something small and red, a thornless rose sitting atop his windowsill. He picked it up and studied it. Drops of dew peppered the petals of the rose, and they glistened against the morning sun. He searched for his father and found him in the kitchen. Sitting at the kitchen table beside an empty plate was a magazine titled Game Informer. John had picked up the October 1995 issue in the grocery store on his way home. He thought the news of Mortal Kombat 3 might excite his son. John would not allow such a game to enter his home, but if kicking some virtual butt lightened Christopher's mood, he'd buy it. Either way, Christopher didn't notice the magazine and crossed the kitchen. He handed his dad the rose. Christopher said, "Dad, I heard someone last night by my window." John's brows furrowed and his stare became cold. Christopher continued, "And I found this on the windowsill this morning." John took the rose from his son and examined it against the backdrop of the morning sun. Nancy arose from her place at the table and studied the rose. She smiled. John set the rose onto the countertop beside their oven. He removed the phone from its wall mount and then dialed 911. Nancy tugged at John's arm as she said, "You can't be serious. It's just a rose. He sleeps on the second floor. No one could get up there." Christopher backed out of the kitchen, and Nancy gave him a quick glance. John, who is a big man, seemed even larger to Christopher. His voice carried authority, and when he spoke, he couldn't help but listen. John demanded that an officer come to them immediately. A predator was prowling their streets. Nancy noticed the fright in Christopher's eyes and shooed him out of the room. John slammed the phone against the wall when the police told him it was likely a prank, and because of that, they would not come. Bits of plastic fell, and they clattered against the countertop. His hands trembled as he heaved as he stood still in thought. Neither Christopher nor Nancy had seen this side of him. John had lost his wife, though in the back of his mind, he knew this rose was insignificant. The thought that someone could be stalking his only son gripped his soul. It strangled whatever hope he had for the future. John felt as though he stood in the cold halls of the hospital once more. This moment, frozen in time, caused a cold stone to knot in his throat. The terror of a stalker stirred the same fear he felt when he watched his former wife cling to hope. Hope did not save him or her on that day. The pneumonia didn't care. Nancy brushed her hair behind her ears and said, "John, it's time for work. Please go. Christopher and I will have a good day." John looked around in the kitchen and saw the shattered phone mount. He felt as though he had awoken to himself and felt disgust in his stomach. He curled his lips as he grabbed his lunch and left for work. John said nothing as he passed from the kitchen and through the doorway outside. The screen door creaked as it shut behind him. Once a moment had passed, Nancy returned to her seat at the table and took a gulp of coffee that had now become cold. Christopher sat at the table beside her. He grabbed the Game Informer magazine and thumbed through its pages. Nancy noticed as he paused on the Mortal Kombat 3 section. Christopher leaned forward. Something caught his interest, and she enjoyed it. Nancy set the cup down and said, "It's October 27th. That game is probably already at the store." Her heart fluttered as she smiled. She continued, "We can go pick it up if you want to." She reached across the table and patted Christopher's hand. He withdrew from her touch and closed the magazine. Christopher said, "I don't want to, and Dad wouldn't let me play it anyway." Nancy's hand hung in the air. She reminded herself that right now, Christopher needed respect more than anything else. She understood she had to respect why her stepson was grieving and allow him to do so. Before he left the kitchen, she called for him to wait. Nancy felt a knot in her throat, and her face felt hot as she said, "I love you, Christopher. If you need someone, I'll be here. I'll always be here." Christopher turned away and walked up the stairs to his room. Nancy sat for a moment and bit her lip. Her hands quivered as her stomach turned. The coffee sat cold and the house quiet. Once more, she reminded herself that he was grieving the loss of his mother. The sting of rejection stung no less. Christopher climbed up the stairs and threw himself upon his bed. He had exhausted whatever tears he had left to cry over the last few years. He couldn't cry anymore, and the world seemed cold and gray. The video games weren't fun, and his new friends didn't understand his agony. Christopher felt that no one understood his suffering, not even his father. He closed his eyes and he said, "I promised that I would stop playing video games if you made it go away. Please let her go." He cast his mind back to a few nights before his mother died. His mother held his hand and squeezed it. Christopher promised he would never play his video games again. This was the payment he offered for his mother's life. In his heart, he felt he had done all he could do to save his mother from the clutches of death. A few days had passed since then, and one night, in the midnight hour, John received a call from the hospital. When his father delivered the news that she had passed in the middle of the night, Christopher sat in shock. He made the bargain a few days prior, and despite tucking the games away, his mother still died. In the world of this child, who was 6 at that time, he was the cause of his mother's death. He didn't offer a better trade. John told him that flu and pneumonia take out thousands of people each year. It was her time to go, but Christopher didn't listen. How could he? His offer wasn't good enough. And now, he looked out of the window from his bedroom. The sun fell against the horizon. Nancy poked her head into the room every so often. At dinner time, she offered him a Happy Meal, chicken nuggets and fries. They sat atop his dresser, cold and untouched. The moon cast its silver glow into his room. He watched the thin branches of trees sway against the wind. A slight scratch against his windowsill broke the silence. Christopher sat up in his bed and looked at his windowsill. A red rose sat on its edge, but he couldn't remember seeing anyone outside his window. His arms shook and his legs wobbled as he arose from his bed. He approached the window and saw the full body of the rose. There wasn't a ladder outside, nor was there anyone moving about. A slight glimmer of something caught his attention in the house beside his. In the bedroom across the way stood a rose bush, no taller than he was. Flecks of blue dust swirled around the rose bush and then dissipated. Christopher pressed his eyes shut and shook his head. He reminded himself that this was probably a dream. Once he peeled his eyes open, his heart raced and his throat became dry. There were many beautiful roses, but Christopher couldn't understand why there was a rose bush in the haunted house next door. It sat in front of the bedroom window and seemed to peer into his room. He felt as though the bush was there for him, and these roses were his to take. He didn't care much for flowers, but this was different. Christopher looked down and gripped the window. He pushed it up and popped open the screen. As he reached forward for the rose, he looked into the house next door and noticed the rose bush had disappeared. His hand trembled as he grabbed the rose. Against the moonlight, he turned the rose, and a subtle waft of blue, glittering dust fell from its petals. Christopher closed the window and returned to his bed at once. Sleep took him, but he did not have a dream. The rose continued to glow until the sun woke the world. His rest remained undisturbed by nightmares or dreams of longing. He turned in his bed late into the morning and awoke. John and Nancy noticed that Christopher slept longer than he usually did and let him be. Once Christopher woke up, Nancy greeted him with a plate of pancakes, glass of milk, and bacon. John had left for work, but he left a note for his son. Beside Christopher's plate of pancakes sat the note. It read, "Son, I am sorry for my behavior yesterday. I would like to talk to you about it in person, but I didn't expect you to sleep for so long. Remember, Nancy and I both love you very much, and we only want what's best for you. I picked up that new fighting game on the way home from work. You can play it. Just don't go out fighting. It's just a game, and remember that. I love you more than anything in the world. Love, Dad." Nancy rocked from side to side and fidgeted with her fingertips. She said, "We can play it now if you want. I can set everything up." Christopher ignored her request and ate the food set out before him. He slurped up the pancakes and the syrup atop them. Nancy stood still, eager for his response. Once his plate was bare and his glass was empty, Christopher pushed the tray of food away. He thought of the rose bush and needed to know if it was still there. Christopher climbed out of bed and looked into the house next door. An empty room stared back at him. Nancy waited, and her smile began to fall. She pushed her hands into her pockets and her shoulders sank. Nancy said, "So, what do you say?" Christopher traced his fingertips down the windowsill and said, "I'd like to be alone." Nancy nodded and stepped out of the doorway. She replied, "I love you," as she closed the door. A long moment of silence hung between them as Nancy stood in the doorway. Her throat knotted and her hands fidgeted. She knew that he was suffering but didn't know what to do. Once she accepted that Christopher needed his space, she closed the door and gave him his peace. Christopher turned around as the door clicked shut. He rummaged through boxes piled on his floor in search of a flashlight and his darkest clothes. Tonight, he would venture into the haunted house next door and find the rose bush. Throughout the day, Christopher paced through the house and couldn't sit still. It didn't matter where he was or what he was doing. He couldn't be in one spot for long. Nancy thought this was a good turn in direction from his usual mopey behavior. But she became concerned when he began collecting things like black gloves and a black ski mask. He even requested a black book bag. She wanted to joke about him robbing a bank, but kept that to herself. Christopher asked to borrow his dad's black work boots. Then he searched the cupboards and drawers for black face paint. Once John came home from work, he stood in awe as Christopher rummaged in vain for things they didn't have. John would have had his father-son talk, but did not want to disrupt his son's behavior. Christopher finally came out of his room It was doing something, and that was good. He was busy until the sun fell, and the night became quiet, and pizza arrived at the door. Dinner was delicious, and John asked if Christopher had played his new game. Nancy shook her head and said nothing. Christopher excused himself from the table. The pizza was great, but more pressing matters were on his mind. He still wore dark clothes and returned to his bedroom, where he sat and waited for his parents to fall asleep. John and Nancy both fell asleep rather soon. John was on his 4th day of work, and Nancy had to wake up bright and early for her shift. Their snores were loud, and the clock read 11:32 p.m. Christopher waited a bit longer. At midnight, Christopher turned out of bed and approached his windowsill. In the bedroom across the way stood a rose bush. He slipped on his black jacket and pulled down his ski mask. Dark clothes concealed him, and then he tiptoed to the back door. So far, so quiet. His hands trembled as he grabbed the handle, and he began to sweat as he turned it. He pulled the doorknob, and the door opened without making a sound. The autumn air brushed against his cheeks, and it caused him to shiver. He closed the door and tiptoed to the back of the haunted house. Vines, once thick and green, had become yellow and dead. Strips of paint on the house had peeled and warped towards the sky. Christopher stepped upon the deck of the home, and it yawned in protest of his presence. He approached the door and wrapped his fingers around the doorknob. His fingertips became numb, and his arms felt heavy. A lump of ice formed in his throat as he turned the doorknob, and then the door yawned open. Christopher stood before a vast, empty room. A thin sheet of dust covered the floor, and it remained undisturbed until now. He entered the room, and a cold breeze pushed against his neck. Goosebumps arose, and his cheeks turned a soft shade of pink. There sat a small nook to his left and a living area to his right. In front of him was a staircase that led to the 2nd floor. He walked up the staircase, and each step creaked as he pushed against it. Christopher reached the 2nd floor and looked straight down the hall. There were 2 bedrooms on each side. A pale light shone from the doorway at the far back left of the hall. He inched closer to the room and then slowed his stride as he approached the edge of the doorway. Christopher's hands were clammy now, and they shook. The air was cold, and he shivered. His legs felt heavy as he tried to move, and then he looked through the doorway. At the center of the room sat a rose bush, and before it was the specter of his mother. Her hair was long and full, and she turned her gaze so that way it met his. She smiled, and so did Christopher. He approached her and held out his hand. She grabbed it and held it tight. Her touch was warm and inviting. His mother, Donna, said, "Honey, I could feel your pain the minute you knew. What has happened?" She brushed her fingertips against his chin, and he felt as though a warm breeze pushed against him. Christopher began to cry and said, "I miss you. I love you. I promised that if I didn't play games, you would get better. I tried to make a deal to save you. We moved away, and now Dad wants Nancy to be my new mom. I want things to go back to how they were." Donna looked into her son's eyes, and tears trickled down her cheeks. She said, "Sweetheart, I'll always be the rose in your garden, and your father did what was right. It was my time to go, and it had nothing to do with video games. Sometimes people get sick and they go somewhere else." Christopher looked into his mom's eyes. He couldn't stop the tears from falling as he said, "I do not want to move on. I feel like if I love Nancy, I won't love you." Donna scooped him up into her arms and held him tight. She whispered, "There's enough love in your heart for both of us. Loving her does not mean you love me any less." Donna leaned away from her son and returned to his stare. She continued, "I know all there is to know, and I know that you're brave and strong, and your father loves you and does his best. I know that Nancy loves you the same way she would love her own son. Trust me when I say this. You can love her. I know you love her. You are free to allow yourself to love her. She is a wonderful person." Donna plucked a purple rose from the bush and handed it to Christopher. She said, "If you ask, you'll find that this is her favorite color." Christopher's lips trembled as he pressed his eyes closed. He wrapped his mother in his arms and said, "I love you." She replied, "I will always love you." He released her then and said, "Thank you, thank you." The cold air returned, and once Christopher opened his eyes, the rose bush and his mother were gone. Dust, which clung to the house, lifted and disappeared. The cracked windows became whole, and the peeling paint healed. Christopher left the house then, and stood before it as it repaired itself. He noticed the same rose bush below his bedroom window, beside the house. He returned home and set the purple rose atop his bed. As the night waned, he unpacked his things and stacked the boxes outside his bedroom door. He did not sleep, but that was okay. As the sunrise came, he heard Nancy begin to stir. Christopher cracked open his door and looked down the hallway. Nancy had passed down it on her way to get coffee. He followed behind with the purple rose in hand. She stopped at the side of the table and poured her morning cup. Christopher tiptoed beside her and looked up, and he said, "What's your favorite color?" Nancy turned around, a bit surprised, and smiled. She said, "Purple." Christopher swung the rose around and handed it to her. Nancy grabbed the rose and noticed the red glowing dust which fell from it. She asked, "What's your favorite color?" "Red," replied Christopher, "and Dad's is yellow." He wrapped his arms around Nancy's waist and held her. Her eyes became wet and she bit her bottom lip. She pushed the cup of coffee aside and knelt to hug him. Her arms were loving and she kissed his cheek. He liked it. Christopher said, "When you get home, I want us to go to the arcade. Daytona USA is a fun racing game, and I want to play it with you." Nancy whispered, "I'll grab all my quarters." Nancy relished the moment and rocked with Christopher in her embrace. She stroked his hair and held him how a mother would. The wounds of yesteryear had begun to heal. Though there was much that needed to be done, the start of a beautiful relationship was upon them. Nancy had a good day that day, and then a good year. Christopher learned that Mom wasn't a name, but a title given to those who earn it, and Nancy had earned it. Together, they had their ups and downs, but in all, they had a wonderful life. The rose bush, for reasons that only Christopher knew, bloomed roses of red, yellow, and purple and blue. It lived on beside the house, below his bedroom window, and never did the sun set upon it.